The final thing I would say to you is a little kind of side note about repetition in and of itself. Okay, so repetition obviously creates pattern. You think about those kind of, depending on your perspective, horrendous or very, very cool kind of shirts that you can get in kind of like H&M and Zara, where you have like multiple like pink flamingos or pineapples, and you think, and the fact that there's multiple kind of elements there adds the pattern, creates the pattern, okay? Repetition is what creates pattern. You could have that in terms of end rhyme, you could have it in terms of internal rhyme, you can have it, as we discussed, in terms of our sound techniques, and that's fine. But you need to be able to talk about it in a particular way, and you need to, again, separate ourselves from the herd and separate ourselves from the rest of the crowd, okay? Terminology like refrain, for example, terminology like anaphora, terminology like lineation, okay? Hopefully now, guys, you're watching this at home and you kind of think, what are these terms? I've never even seen these terms before. I've never been told these terms. And that's kind of giving you the idea of why the guys in the grinds do so well, versus kind of going through the motions, is because this is the aspect, like 30%, guys, just as a side note, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in terms of vocab, it's something that we have in terms of the grinds. We have a column for vocab at the start of every class, and invariably what happens, we have about 10 to 15 words at the end of each individual class that are hopefully new and exciting for you that you haven't seen before. Exciting is probably a superlative, it's probably a bit of a stretch, but certainly useful. And you're going to think, wow, I've never heard that word before. I'm 100% going to use that and start to amalgamate that into my own answers. So that's something that we produce at the end of every grind class as well. 30% of everything you write in your English Leaving Cert, both paper 1 and paper 2, will be based on the vocabulary that you use, your own vocab choice, your own word selection, okay? So that's very, very important that we note that. Refrain, anaphora, and lineation might be a little bit of a start on that road, guys. Refrain is repetition, but when it gives us some sort of a musical quality, it's almost like a psalm or a hymn in terms of church. Anaphora, guys, is repetition when something is mentioned at the start of a poem and then the poet periodically returns to that consistently. And lineation, guys, is when there is one line and that can be chopped and changed a little bit. Paul Durkin, really big fan of using lineation, but when it's chopped and changed a little bit, but when that one line crops up over and over again, okay? So that's the third and final element of pattern that we're going to look at in terms of today, because obviously we've so much to get through. That's an aspect of pattern, guys. That's the first thing that we should be able to identify with regards to our unseen and studied poetry, okay? Again, if you need to pause it, take the terminology down, do so now. We're going to move on to our imagery. Little things like that, guys, hopefully, again, not to kind of keep going back over it, but little things like understanding how significant vocab is, our timing, which we'll get on to now in a few moments' time. These are the separators, as we like to call them within our classes here. These are the little things, and they're only kind of nuggets of information. But once you understand, right, I only have 22 minutes to take on my unseen poem, but I also know it's a very achievable 5%. Once I know kind of, all the new vocab, all the new terminology, again, these are our separators as discussed, okay? Imagery, very quickly, guys, we won't dwell on this for as long. However, I will put a little star beside this. And imagery, guys, is effectively our poetry. That's what it is that we're dealing with, okay? We have a couple of things within imagery that we can kind of skip over. Not skip over, essentially, but I basically have them there, guys, if you want to have a little look at the notes on page 6 as we're going through this. Bottom of page 6, you have, again, what I often kind of refer to as, it almost sounds like a kind of 6-minute workout video, the lit abs, but this is key. This is what poets do the entire time. It stands for the literal to the abstract. I'll show you an example of what I mean by this today as well. But when poets take something literal, like, for example, going back to that Sylvia Plath poem, guys, Mirror, even if you take child, for example, and you have the term ceiling, not this troublous wringing of hands, this dark ceiling without a star. You take the word ceiling there, you take something literal, tangible, that we all know and can all relate to describe something much more abstract, like an idea, a concept, okay? I have that there at the bottom of page 6, guys. It normally takes me a little bit more time to go through it with you. It will be something that I focus heavily on in the grinds, but for now, for today, that's just a little insight into it. Have a little consideration of that, especially, guys, for your unseen poetry in your Leaving Cert, in your mocks and then in your Leaving Cert, okay? The literal to the abstract, guys, the one thing that you should be mindful of when you sit down finally to your unseen material, unseen poetry, ask yourself, is this poem an extended metaphor, okay? What I'm reading right now, is this on face value? Again, you go back to the conventional, unconventional. Am I taking exactly what I need to take from this poem? Or is there kind of a subtle nuance to it? Is there a kind of a much more kind of hidden meaning? Is it kind of much more layered, all right? So ask yourself, extended metaphor. That kind of sums up the concept of the literal to the abstract, okay? Another aspect in terms of imagery that you guys should be very aware of, considering I just mentioned how significant vocabulary is for you guys, is the idea of vocab choice, all right? Little side note, little one-liner for you. No poem anywhere ever has any word in it by mistake, okay? It's something, a little exercise that I do within the grinds is I show you one version of a poem and then I show you then the actual version that we're dealing with, and it's kind of 6 or 7 or 8 or 100 drafts later and how different it is to the initial kind of, I suppose, birth of that poem, all right? So no poem anywhere has a word in it by mistake. That's beautiful for you guys to hear because it means that you can select any word that you want from the poem and say, right, there's significance behind this, okay? You look at Out by Robert Frost, for example, the most important word within that poem is the word so. Because the enjambment ends, the pace of the poem, it's one line onto the next, onto the next, onto the next, and then it's so, and it settles down and it's preparing us for really, really bad news. That word that we spoke about before in terms of Sylvia Plath's poetry, the word ceiling, okay, is the most significant word within that poem because it suggests an enclosure, an entrapment, a lack of growth, a lack of progression, as long as Sylvia Plath is around, okay? So we're mindful, very mindful of our vocab choice going forward. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on today. The final aspect, guys, of our imagery is our comparisons, okay? Now, this is something I often talk to my students about. It's often, I give them a little one-liner here. Comparisons effectively make poetry, all right? And a little one-liner I always tell my students to use is that I tell them, you know, that comparisons are used by poets so that allows us mere mortals to identify and understand exactly what they're saying. It's a little bit of humour, as you're all laughing at home. Not ha-ha funny, but it's a little bit of humour, it's a little bit of personality. That's effectively what we're looking at as examiners. We want to hear your voice. We want to get a sense of who you are in terms of on the page itself, all right? So when you say something like, you know, poets using comparisons allows us mere mortals to relate, to understand what they're saying, is suggesting that poets, in terms of their intelligence, that there's something else, that they're kind of godlike figures, all right? In terms of comparisons, we'll all be familiar with, I suppose, the main ones: simile, metaphor, again, personification, pathetic fallacy, for example. Like, those are, again, in the grinds themselves, guys, what we tend to do is I'll pause, I'll give you kind of 60 seconds to have a little think about it yourself. But those are the 4 that I would expect you guys to be aware of and understand and jot down straight away. You know, similes using like or as, metaphors not using like or as. Metaphors, guys, I'd ask you to put a little plus sign beside the metaphor there. The reason being is because metaphors are stronger than similes. Now, again, that's not the best take-home point that you guys are going to hopefully get out of this 75 minutes, but I really feel it's a very, very good little one-liner to know, because now, when you're responding to any studied poet and any studied poem, now you can implement the one line, you know, and you can say something along the lines as, I found it terribly interesting the way Sylvia Plath elected to use a metaphor here rather than a simile, full stop. This shows us as readers how strongly she felt about X. So what we've done there, guys, with a little plus, all right, understanding that metaphors are stronger than similes, we've given us 2 sentences. You've given ourselves the guts of about 5 or 6 lines, arguably half a paragraph, in terms of taking on, you know, coupled with the actual quote itself, in terms of taking on one little metaphor. All right, and again, it's your response. You're responding to it and say, you know, how interesting you found it. In reality, you didn't, you know, and you're not finding it interesting, but you're dissecting it and you're talking about it in that way, okay? Personification, human characteristics to non-human entities. Pathetic fallacy, guys, when the weather reflects the mood or the atmosphere reflects the mood. Very, very important one. I'm often kind of amazed that individuals have gotten to the start of 6th year or halfway through 6th year when, again, some of us join the grinds and they have no idea of pathetic fallacy, no idea of enjambment, for example, etc., etc., right? But those are the 4 kind of main comparisons that I would look at the start. Again, a term you should know since 3rd year English, juxtaposition, not a true comparison in I suppose the truest form, but certainly kind of a dramatic change between I suppose the way it was once and then the way it is now. So a dramatic change that can come in theme, tone, mood. It's an excellent one to know. Oxymoron, for example, another good one, you know. Contrast, for example, paradoxes, those kind of elements in terms of our comparisons. There's a myriad of, I suppose, usage for juxtaposition, oxymoron, and then again, there's so many more, I suppose, comparisons that we could use, but that's not a bad start to have a little look at, all right? So again, that's all on page 6 there again, or to be added to page 6 again in terms of the notes, all right? So guys, those are the 3 aspects of imagery that we need to be talking about. You can see, anybody a bit of a keen eye and read the writing there, you can see that there's a little mathematical equation on the board. I'll throw it up here, make it a little bit easier, which is pattern plus imagery, which we've looked at so far, plus sensuousness. I always feel it'd be a good pub quiz question. How many S's in sensuousness? If we jump to page 7, there's a little bit of fill in the blanks kind of exercise for us. But sensuous, guys, is the 3rd element of how we dissect our poetry. Guys, top of the page there on page 7, rather than me going to the board and having it as overkill, you can see here our sensuous material is effectively when aesthetic language evokes one of our 5 senses, okay? And that is how we define aesthetic language. It is language that evokes a response within the reader. You guys need to know that definition, all right? It's something that I talk about heavily within our Paper 1 notes in the Paper 1 classes. If you need to stop it, rewind the video, listen to me say it again, jot it down, guys. Very, very important you know how to define aesthetic language. Sensuous language then becomes a massively important element of that. Okay, sight, sound, touch, taste and smell. You guys jot down very quickly. Besides sight, we're jotting down visual qualities. So if you get a lot of colour and a lot of detail, it becomes visual. Sound is our aural qualities, A-U or A-L. So if we can hear it, again, our sound techniques already covered today. Touch, again, is tactile, T-A-C-T-I-L-E. And that's if there's a vibration or a jolt, or if there's a breeze, or if it's hot or cold. Okay, that'll often add in very much to pathetic fallacy. Taste is what's called gustatory. It's very rare that you get kind of tasty or delicious poems, but anytime you get anything mentioned that's sweet or honey or things like that, or sour, again, you think of Arrival of the Bee Box, for example. Sylvia Plath mentions honey a number of times within that. She also mentions flowers, and that brings in the smell quality there, and that's what's called olfactory, O-L-F-A-C-T-O-R-Y, okay? Again, we talk about the separators, guys. A lot of the students, a lot of your friends in your day school will know about sight and sound, maybe even touch, the taste and smell. Now, when you come across anything to do with cut grass, anything to do with flowers, anything to do with honey, anything along those lines, you can bring in gustatory and olfactory. Again, we go back to our topic sentence, guys. Imagine putting that at the top of, or the start of a paragraph, versus, you know, again, other individuals who aren't, you know, that you comment on and you say Sylvia Plath's use of olfactory and gustatory sensuous imagery within this poem was phenomenal. Now we're separating our paper from everyone else's, okay? So it's those little things, guys. That's our sensuousness. That is the final element, I suppose, just before we look at suggestiveness. What you guys are going to try and do, all right? And you'll see this in the set of study notes that I have here. At the end of every poem that I've given you here in terms of Mirror, Arrival of the Bee Box, Poppies in July, whatever the poem is, I have pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness written out for you, and a little bit of white space there for you guys to fill in your own kind of interpretation, your own little one-liners. What you need to do, guys, is make sure that in every single poem that you look at, be it unseen or studied, that's the information you look for. And that's the information you talk about, okay? Because it'll give you the equal sign there. It'll give you what's called the suggestiveness. And suggestiveness is twofold, guys. It is effectively what the poet is trying to say within the poem, but mainly and predominantly, it's your interpretation of that. Now, you're going to get your interpretation from all this information. It goes without saying, if you read a poem that has incredibly morose, macabre, pathetic fallacy, it's dark, the mood is dark, the imagery is harrowing and ominous and worrying, well then obviously the suggestiveness is that it is going to be a very dark, depressing, upsetting piece of text, all right? Vice versa, you get, positive, jovial, really nice terminology, nice imagery, potentially maybe even a coda in there. Again, if you're familiar with coda and the musical qualities of poetry, you get that in there as well. Again, vice versa, then your suggestive qualities is that the poem is going to be jovial and upbeat and incredibly positive, okay? So guys, that's all contained there on page 8, at the top of the page there, effectively getting you guys to consider, right, how do I respond to this poem? How do I feel about what I've just read there? All right? The point that I would make at the bottom of page 8 there where it says, a couple of little one-liners. We go back to that term impact. Even if you want to write the word impact down beside that page there and just on that little bit of white space, using terminology like I gravitated towards the sensuous material within this poetry, okay? The olfactory and sensuous imagery allowed me to enter this world that Sylvia Plath had created. This is the kind of lines. It's almost BS, guys, and I understand, and even me listening to my own self saying it, but that's exactly what examiners gravitate towards. Is that response. It's some element, to sum it up, what it is effectively is, in terms of it's your response to some technical elements. I gravitated towards, that's the response to the, to the vivid and visceral imagery within this poem, and that's the technical aspect, okay? I have a couple there for you. I was struck by, potentially, the euphonous or cacophonous tones within this poem. The title suggests X, whereas the body of the text suggests Y, or clarifies Y. That's a really good one there, guys, to use with a juxtaposition. Even if you want to write a little example, I give you there, if you want to write down child beside it, in terms of Sylvia Plath as well. You think of the connotations, is a really good word that we're going to talk about now as we go on. Connotations, you think, what are the connotations associated with this poem and specifically with the title? I'm going to talk to you about how to read every single poem that you look at. You ask yourself, what are the connotations associated with this title? What do I think about? You go back to what I'm saying there in terms of child. Well, you think of nurture, you think of love, you think of progression, you think of care and duty of care. And you think of happiness. And again, those are the connotations that are associated with the title child. The body of the text, again, is a clear juxtaposition. It's dark and it's harrowing. It's arguably one of the most depressing poems that you're likely to read throughout your studies. Okay, so the title suggests X, whereas the body of the text clarifies Y, or something along those lines. Okay, but guys, there's a couple of little things anyway to take from those 2 pages. The bottom of page 8 there, the overarching, I suppose, statement to make or about the bottom of page 8 there is ask yourself constantly how and why. Why have the poets used this type of technical aspects? How have they put it across? And then in turn, then what does that make you feel? All right, that is our PISS, guys. That is 17.5% of your grade. You get that right, it's certainly 5%, okay? Because that, coupled with your timing in terms of your unseen poetry, you do that, you have to be rewarded for it, all right? So it's definitely 5% of our grade, and then again, it is impossible to get 12.5% in terms of your studied poets without falling back on that information, all right? If a lot of that stuff that I've spoken about is new today, or even the words that I'm using throughout, like little things like coda, connotations, something we're going to talk about consistently now over the next little bit when we start looking at our studied poetry, vignettes. If this terminology is brand new for you, just as a heads up, this is the caliber of language that you need to be using to get into a H1, H2, all right? And this is the kind of constant caliber of language that we're discussing within the grinds, all right? So that's just a heads up. The final little aspect that I would talk about before we start looking at kind of unseen poetry and then jumping straight into study poetry is on page 9 there. And the last little aspect in terms of how to read any poem. Now, I won't go through this word for word verbatim with you guys, but I will say is on page 9, these are the things that you should be thinking about in conjunction with our pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness when you're taking on individual poems. There's a couple of things there that you guys will be well familiar with. Imagery, obviously, metaphor, similes, personification, figurative language, if you want to write that in beside that final or the second last bullet point there on page 9. Figurative language, main imagery, tone, punctuation. If you want to write in lack of punctuation beside that as well, that term enjambment that I've mentioned a couple of times today as well, please do so now. The idea of enjambment. Enjambment is run-on lines. It's not necessarily a lack of punctuation, but a lot of the times, again, the two are very, very linked. Okay, again, that gives us pace, it gives speed, it gives importance to what's happening within the text. Vocab choice, we've spoken about structure, shape, we've spoken about all these things. One thing I have mentioned, I've more alluded to it, rather than kind of highlighting how significant it is. I have said in today's class how you need to take on 8 to 10 reference points per poem. One of those reference points should be every single time the title. So on page 9 there, guys, make sure you highlight that term there, the title, okay, and how significant it is. All right. Ask yourself every time, what are the connotations, all right, associated with this title? Are they positive? Are they negative? If there's any date included within the title, that's a quick, surefire way of telling that the poem is a vignette. A vignette, guys, is a snapshot. It's a moment in time. It's a moment in history. Okay, 90% of poetry at Leaving Cert level are vignettes. So make sure that we're highlighting our title and we're asking ourselves what is the significance of the title. And the final, I know I've gone from bottom to top here. Nonetheless, top of page 9, ask yourself, who is talking? If it is the poet, it tends to be confessional poetry. So I jot that word down beside the poet there, confessional poetry. If it's a character, we're going to use a term called poetic persona, which I think is a really, really good term to use. Again, it's not widely used. It's a great thing to note that if it's someone else speaking, if the poet is using a different voice, it's poetic persona. And then if it's an object, we're all familiar with the concept of personification. We need to know that. What are they talking about? Now, that's the subject matter of the poem. That's different to the theme. It's just what is the subject matter? What is effectively the focal point? What are they saying about the subject, however, and the message of the poem, if you want to write in that this is thematic. It's a really good word to have there as well, thematic. What's the thematic approach of the author or the poet in this regard? And the final fourth bullet point I'd ask you to write in there underneath that is, how are they saying it? And that brings in tone, okay? Something we'll cover a little bit later on is there are 3 T's that you need to be aware of when you're dissecting every poem, and that's theme, tone, and techniques. And that's how we dissect it here within the Academy. We dissect the poem within an inch of its life. We go through all the technical aspects so that effectively you, the student, you, the candidate, can pick and choose what technical aspects you want to rely on heavily. So we go with it that way. And then what we also do then is we kind of reflect then, and what ends up happening is when we dissect the techniques, that reveals the theme, and that reveals, I suppose, the message of the poem and the tone of the poem as well. All right. So guys, page 9 and 10 there, that's how we dissect our poem. You can see then on the next page we have our kind of pattern, imagery, sensuousness and suggestiveness. That's something for you guys at a later stage to go back and have a little look at, just to ask yourself, can I remember the 3 things Gavin told me about pattern, the 3 things he told me about imagery, the 5 things about sensuousness, and do I have an ability then to respond with impact with regards to suggestiveness? I can't stress enough, guys, what we've covered within the 45 to 50 minutes there of today's class. I can't stress enough how significant that information is, all right? That is how you dissect your poetry. It's important that you have an understanding of, I suppose, the understanding of aesthetic language and what makes up aesthetic language, okay? So on that point, okay, you can see on page 11, a couple of things I want to walk you through on page 11 here in terms of, there's a past paper question, 2014, the poetry element. And now it says 70 marks there because obviously it's the 50 and the 20. The Peninsula here by Seamus Heaney is the unseen poem that I'll have a quick scan of. What I would say is a couple of things, is you look at the title there straight away. That's what you dissect first. You have a little look, you highlight the title, The Peninsula. Guys, if, just a little side note, a little star up here as well, not a bad thing to note, because this happens a lot in unseen poetry. They give you an unseen poem that has a location, a place attached to it in terms of that idea, okay? The Peninsula, when that happens, the poem tends to be incredibly visual, all right? So there's a huge amount of visual, sensuous material in it because it has to describe the place, okay? So the peninsula, there again, we highlight that. Once you have your title highlighted, guys, you immediately jump to your questions and you highlight our questions. You will have, I'll show you on this board over here, you will have a choice. So you'll have 1A and 1B, or a question 2 element, right? And hopefully now all of this, I suppose, the huge amount of work that we've done in terms of our stylistic element, why this becomes so significant, okay? 1A is a 10-mark question, 1B is a 10-mark question, our style question, or our question 2 question, I'll get onto that now in a second, that is a 20-mark question, all right? 1A, guys, typically tends to be something to do with imagery, okay, and 1B tends to be something to do with a theme, the message, maybe the poet themselves, all right? That's typically, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but typically that is what happens. So make sure that when we're preparing for the unseen poetry, you know how to establish the imagery, everything we've done in this morning's class, you know how to establish the imagery, you know then, again, that typically the imagery, the tone of the piece, again, the spoken word, that'll reveal the theme, the thematic element. As we said, guys, the 3 T's, okay? That'll cover the 1A and 1B questions, all right? 10 marks each. They're going to be typically about 3/4 of an A4 page to an A4 page. You're going to have 2 to 3 points within each one of them. I think 2 solid points each works very well. Individual paragraph, 5 marks. Again, your point, you're going to reference 2 or 3 times. Next paragraph, next 5 marks, etc., etc. Or, and this is what I encourage a lot of you guys to take on, is a style-based question, all right? And it's typically a style-based question. This happens more often than not. Be prepared for a style-based question, and that'll be on your ability to look at aesthetic language, to look at the technical aspects of the poem that you've just read, and to respond to it, okay? Now, something that I have, normally I don't have them in this set of notes here today, I will have in terms of the grinds themselves. We have a huge number of sample answers in terms of the unseen poetry, those style questions specifically as well, because they are very much applicable for a number of other different types of questions as well. Okay, guys, in the next couple of pages you have a poem by Michael Longley called Wounds, and you have a Robert Frost poem called Out, Out. If you want to jot down a couple of things at the top of those pages there, those are 2 poems there that are incredibly rich in technical aspects, okay? They're very rich in poetic techniques. So if you were to pause the video now, go back, have a little look at what we've covered, you know, in terms of pattern, imagery, sensuousness, and suggestiveness, look at your own notes, dissect those 2 poems. Take kind of 6 minutes per poem and try and dissect them to the best of your ability. 2 poems that are incredibly rich with technical aspects, okay?